Hi, this is Dr. Steve Smith, and welcome back to my YouTube page. I'm also the author of The Word of the Lord, 7 Essential Principles for Catholic Scripture Study, which was published in 2012 by Our Sunday Visitor Press. And I also teach Sacred Scripture at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Today I want to talk with you about biblical scholarship. My seminarians read a wealth of Catholic biblical scholars. Everyone from St. Augustine and St. Irenaeus to modern Catholic biblical scholars like our former Pope Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. But one of the questions I get asked in class, often enough from my seminarians, is can I and should I be reading non-Catholic authors as I try to understand Catholic theology, especially Catholic biblical theology? Now, a more sophisticated answer involves both yes and no, or yes with a caution, which is to say that I do encourage my students to read, for example, Protestant biblical scholarship. The question is, what sort of Protestant biblical scholarship and to what end? And is there a kind of a filter to be able to apprehend truth and error, or also where Catholic biblical theology might go beyond something that a Protestant biblical scholar might say? But with those sort of general cautions in mind, what I want to do today is suggest 5 non-Catholic scholars and authors that I think every Catholic seminarian owes it to himself to read at least something from. The first is probably a very familiar name to many, C.S. Lewis. Many people are familiar with C.S. Lewis's children's novels, the Chronicles of Narnia, but many are less familiar with the fact that Lewis was actually a literary critic and a don at Oxford, and a very serious scholar of 16th century poetry and literature, and an author in his own right. Aside from those novels I mentioned, he wrote a number of very important texts to philosophy, like The Abolition of Man, and his general contributions to theology, especially for the general reader. Perhaps most famously, Mere Christianity, which actually began as a series of BBC radio addresses. I think the reason for reading C.S. Lewis, for someone who's enrolled in a theology program, and particularly studying biblical theology, may not be immediately obvious. But once you begin reading Lewis, it sort of becomes self-evident. One of Lewis's great contributions is his clarity in writing, particularly in taking fairly dense or intricate theological concepts like the Holy Trinity or the Incarnation of Christ, and explaining those concepts in very lucid ways. For example, in Mere Christianity, he has what he calls the trilemma with regard to the person of Christ. And you can see it in his book, Mere Christianity. The way it works essentially is, for him, it comes down to basically 3 possibilities. Jesus is either a lunatic, what Lewis says is on the equivalent of a poached egg, right? He's a lunatic, or he's a liar, someone who's trying to deceive others, or he's exactly who he said he was. And Lewis says, I'm trying to avoid the argument that someone would say Jesus is just a nice human being, a good teacher, for example. It's contributions like that that I think make Lewis one of the most important Protestant scholars that one can read as one comes into a seminary program. Another reason for reading him is his ability to use metaphors that are very timely even today. Even though Lewis has been dead for some time, his clarity is able to reach a person on the street in the same way in 2015 or 16 Chicago or Baltimore as on the streets of London back in the 1950s. Lewis's contributions to the spiritual life are prolific in terms of his literature. For example, his book, The Screwtape Letters, should be on every seminarian's bookshelf, just in terms of the kinds of insights he brings to temptation in this fictitious conversation between a demon and his underling. One of my favorite expressions by C.S. Lewis: "I believe in Christianity as I believe in the rising of the sun. Not only do I see it, but by it I see everything else." And if one were to have a pocket copy of Mere Christianity and delve into some of his other writings, for that matter even the Chronicles of Narnia, I think it would benefit what I call one's biblical worldview, right? His sense of clarity about ultimate issues of life and death, of love, truth, and beauty. Certainly pick up a copy of Mere Christianity and read it sometime during your seminary formation. Moving on to a different kind of author, someone who is more of a biblical critic and translator, I want to propose that seminarians come in contact with and read the works of Robert Alter. Robert Alter is a Jewish theologian who works primarily in Old Testament literature. He wrote a book called The Art of Biblical Narrative, which is used in many colleges and seminaries as an introduction to reading the Bible as literature. Now, I know some may have a certain reservation or discomfort when hearing the phrase "the Bible as literature" and say, what about inspiration? What about the Bible as the sacred texts of divinely inspired realities? Well, indeed they are those things. And I don't think, for one, that Alter is an obstacle, or that reading the Bible as literature, as he proposes, is an obstacle, that it's an either-or. A Catholic seminarian begins with the foundational principles that I talk about in my book, The Word of the Lord, 7 Essential Principles for Catholic Scripture Study. And once he's grounded in those, then there are many tools that are at our disposal. For example, narrative criticism, which offers some strengths as well as limitations in reading the Bible in accord with the way one might read Shakespeare or E.E. Cummings, or for that matter, a modern novel. So things like plot and irony and tone and repetition, symbolism, and other criteria are used by narrative critics, and Alter is at the, I think, forefront of that movement over the last generation of helping people to read the Bible in a fresh way in accord with what's called narrative criticism. Another reason I want to propose reading Robert Alter is that he has provided his own translations, or you might say retranslations, of our familiar texts. If you read the Bible in the, for example, Revised Standard Version, Catholic edition, or even in another edition like the New Jerusalem or New American Bible, or even the treasured King James, the difficulty with translations is it really is a very human process. And while we want to be very faithful to the Church's teachings and to use very good Catholic translations, I think there is some merit to also reading translations of other respected scholars and academics like Alter, because they can provoke new thought about those familiar passages. Alter uses a phrase that he calls the heresy of explanation, and he says that many modern English translations engage in this heresy, by which he means going beyond the essentials of translating from the original language, for example Hebrew, into modern English, and explaining. Modern translations often tend to smooth out or to bring in additional verbiage that isn't always there in the text. And sometimes those additions, in fact, I would argue most often, they are necessary. But they do move us away from the original text in some sense, and Alter's trying to recover that. And Hebrew is a very concise language. For example, he talks about how Psalm 23, right, the psalm everyone knows, has about 1/3 of the words in Hebrew as it does in most modern English translations. Now, to illustrate one of the things that Alter is trying to bring about, and this whole heresy of explanation idea, let me direct your attention to a very famous narrative in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. In Genesis 16, the so-called well scene of Jacob and his soon-to-be wife Rebekah, right, where they meet. And if you are to go to your translation in Genesis and read it, what you'll find is that the conjunction or particle "and" in most translations is hardly present in most English translations. There's maybe 5, 6, or perhaps 7 conjunctions "and" throughout that narrative, beginning in, I believe, verse 24. However, if you look at Alter's translation, it has over 15 particles or conjunction "and." And it's clear when you actually read the text, and I won't do it here for brevity, but the question Alter asks in one of his commentaries is, why are these and, A and D, why are this little "and" removed from what is in the Hebrew present many more times, about 15? And he says it's to smooth out the language. But in the narrative of Jacob meeting Rebekah, when Alter puts the "ands" back into the text as they are there in Hebrew, something startling happens. The reader experiences a certain fatigue. And Alter says that's, in a sense, intentional, in the sense that one gets the rhythm of Rebekah going back and forth to water the camels and to the men and so on and so forth. And so all of these "ands" create a kind of rhythm and show a kind of heroism, even in just a very tiny word, the heroic nature of this simple, small woman carrying the water back and forth, to and fro. Now, is it possible to see that without all those, what some might say, extra "ands" in the text? Well, sure. But if the Hebrew has it in there, why are we trying to doctor it up by taking them out and smoothing it out? And just one example that I think Alter brings to the fore. Many, many more examples could abound. I'm not trying to in any way preference Alter. And sometimes I look at one of his translations and I may shake my head or scratch my head or want to throw the book at the wall. But I do think that the advantage of reading someone like Alter is that it exposes us to our familiarity with Scripture, which in some ways is a good thing and in some ways challenges us to get back to that biblical word. And Alter now has, I think, 5 or 6 books that he by which he's translated the Old Testament. His first one is on the Pentateuch. He's got another one on the historical books, the Psalms, the Wisdom, and a brand new book on a Song of Songs and some of the other writings of the Old Testament. Let's talk a little bit about a true biblical commentator. Alter is really more of a translator, and C.S. Lewis is a thinker and theologian, but neither are really biblical commentators as such. And I want to recommend a Protestant biblical scholar. I think he would identify himself as an evangelical Protestant, and that's Craig Keener. One of the reasons I like Craig Keener, K-E-E-N-E-R, is that he's a very astute reader of the biblical text, and he uses a lot of ancient primary sources in annotating his arguments. When you read Keener, it's very clear that who he's reading, whether it's Philo, Josephus, St. Augustine, or some contemporary scholar. But one of the things Keener does particularly well is going back to the Jewish roots. You will find when you read, for example, his commentaries on the Gospel of John or his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, that he is just as quick to quote someone like Philo of Alexandria as he is a contemporary like N.T. Wright or some other modern biblical commentator. And I think there's an advantage to that kind of an approach, because too often today, biblical scholars will stop over the last 50 years and only draw from their peers and colleagues, which in many ways becomes a kind of a conversation that's happening or could be happening in cubicles of some academic corridor. And Keener understands that there's a very rich, deep legacy of biblical scholarship that goes back not just decades, but centuries. And he often will catalog his arguments in exegesis, beginning with Jewish and then early Christian scholars and moving forward. So you get a kind of a rich spectrum of thought. Now again, that question is posed, yeah, but, right? Yeah, but he's not a Catholic scholar, and so isn't it possible to be accidentally led into error there? I suppose that's true, but I suppose that's true of a Catholic author. Just because a person is Catholic doesn't mean that we should obviously rubber stamp everything they say. We've got to check all our sources that we use against the regula fide, right? Against the Church's tradition. If you want to simplify it, think of the Catechism as a kind of a lens through which to begin to critically read biblical commentaries. But I think you'll find on the main that you read someone like Craig Keener, he passes that lens test fairly well. Now, having said that, I would be the first to admit that Keener does not, at least to my mind, have a sacramental vision of the world. He's an evangelical Christian, non-denominational, I believe. So what I find in good Protestant biblical scholars is this. I can read them and learn much about the historical and, yes, in many ways, theological horizon of a text, especially in someone like Keener, who is so adept at bringing together so many sources. In fact, I just had 4 seminarians in my office and was explaining that Keener's 4-volume commentary on the book of Acts will be, get this, just short of 6,000 pages. At which they laughed and said maybe we should use these as dumbbells, instead of commentaries, because each one is about yay thick, about 2,000 pages. Is that overkill? Well, that's another story, whether it's going too far. But I think it's safe to say that someone like Keener, and I can think of a number of other names as well, Gregory Beale, to some extent, to many extents perhaps, N.T. Wright, James Dunn, Scott McKnight. These are all modern evangelical, or at least non-Catholic Christian scholars who bring a wealth of teaching and wisdom to the biblical text, but they don't have the advantage of being Catholics. And so the sacramental vision of, and the Catholic vision with a capital C, is not probably going to be there. And so you have to read these in a kind of supplemental sense. But certainly Keener would be near the very top of my list of such biblical commentators. Let's get a little bit more technical. Someone that you may not find in even a theological bookstore, but is well worth looking for and finding. And that is a newer scholar, contemporary scholar, whose name is Crispin Fletcher-louis. Crispin Fletcher-louis. He does have monographs or books that are available. You probably would want to find them in a library, but you're much more apt to find articles by Crispin Fletcher-louis. Fortunately, he does have several essays that are available in larger Bible dictionaries. For example, the InterVarsity Press has a series called The Dictionary of the Bible, and they've got many volumes, so Old Testament, New Testament. And Fletcher-louis has an article in the 2nd edition of the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, which is a very fine dictionary. And his article is on the priesthood, and frankly, it's one of the best essays on priesthood as it relates to the Bible that I've read. And he's a non-Catholic. Without going into much detail, Fletcher-louis has correctly understood that over the last 100 or 200 years, there has been a kind of a myopia among biblical scholars to a kind of a disdain for priesthood, looking at it as a Johnny-come-lately in the biblical story of the Old Testament, something that was tacked on at the end. And it calls to mind scholars like Julius Wellhausen and others, those great Old Testament source critics who believed that the priestly source, for example, of the Pentateuch, was the final source that was compiled onto this fourfold narrative that was being brought together over time. And as such, the priestly school of thought kind of capitalized on the fact that they, in some way, some might say, hijacked the earlier texts that had more of a morality code but less of a sacrificial orientation to them. Okay, now that's not Crispin Fletcher-louis, that's sort of the older school of thought. of more traditional 20th century biblical scholarship. And Crispin Fletcher-Louis rightly critiques that myopia, that sense that, hey, there's something missing here called the priesthood, guys, and it's very important to understanding the Old Testament and the New. And so if nothing else, read his article on priesthood in that dictionary, and you'll have a great sense of the situation that we find ourselves in 2015 and 2016 in terms of how many biblical scholars have overlooked priesthood and its sacrificial nature. And what's astounding again is that Fletcher-Louis is doing this as a non-Catholic. I believe he's an Anglican scholar, if memory serves. But I think you'll find the article in many ways very, very helpful in understanding atonement, sacrifice, the nature and the value, the centrality of priesthood to the Old as well as to the New Testament. And of course, he starts in the Old and then goes into the New Testament, the priesthood of Jesus. He understands and conceives correctly so Adam as a high priestly figure, and it's just a marvelous article. And if you want to go a level deeper, go online and Google Crispin Fletcher-Louis and see if you can find some of his other articles on Jesus and his Christology, and I think you'll be well served. Last but not least, let me recommend one more Jewish scholar. I believe we've had 3 Christian scholars, so one more Jewish scholar of our 5, and that would be a name that comes out of the University of Chicago, Leon Kass. Leon Kass, K-A-S-S, is a Jewish scholar who's really a physicist. And he wrote a book on Genesis called The Beginning of Wisdom. And it is really one of the freshest, most insightful, and thought-provoking books that I've read on Genesis over the last 10 years. And seminarians and students and peers of mine that have read Kass and this volume on Genesis, The Beginning of Wisdom, tend to agree with that point of view. I'll give you just one example of why Kass is worth reading. Take the narrative of the patriarch Joseph, Jacob's son. Most children, Catholic children, from the age of 5 or 6 or 8, learn of Joseph as a great hero, in fact, like a superhero of the Old Testament, right? One of these great figures like Noah and so on, that he's all good. Well, Kass sees more than meets the eye in the story of Joseph, which really begins in earnest in Genesis 37 and goes really up to chapter 48. So in about those 11 chapters there, the narrative, long narrative of Joseph being sold into slavery and then eventually winning his freedom and telling his brothers what you intended for bad, God intended for good, and all of that, right? So Joseph is this great figure. But Kass goes through the text very carefully, and in the chapter where he deals, in the part of the book, where he deals with Joseph, what you begin to see is that there's actually both a positive and a negative to Joseph. There are those virtues, right? We can compare him to Christ as kind of a type of Christ, as a redeemer figure. But Kass brings something to the fore that I never saw before, which is that in some ways there is a kind of a darker side to Joseph, in the sense that some of his short-sightedness in his dealings with Pharaoh actually are, one could argue, at the very root cause of the situation that Israel finds itself in the beginning of the book of Exodus. I challenge you to read through the Joseph story carefully, and if you can, pick up Kass's book and see if you agree with me. In some sense, I'll cut to the chase and suggest what Kass does, and that is that rather than being strictly a two-dimensional hero, Joseph emerges in some sense as an anti-Moses figure, and as sort of a someone who is almost like a Jewish Pharaoh, someone who shares Pharaoh's mindset of being a shrewd manager and not necessarily someone who has God's vision for God's people. In fact, some of the dealings that Joseph engages in on behalf of Pharaoh, remember he's appointed by Pharaoh, do save the people, but at what cost of actually putting the Egyptian people into Pharaoh's hands as well as all of their wealth. And so as the story of Exodus begins and Genesis ends, you have a situation where one could argue, as Kass does, that Joseph has not had a full vision He has not had God's vision at hand, but he made, in some sense, hasty monetary decisions, managerial decisions that put later generations of Israel's in harm's way when a Pharaoh came who they did not know, right? There came into Egypt a Pharaoh who Joseph did not know, and he had much different intentions. Most believe this would be Ramses, as his predecessor did. And he, the Pharaoh that is, then doubles down on the Israelites. And we tend to see Pharaoh as the big bad guy, Ramses, when in fact in some sense it may well be, in a manner of speaking, Joseph's lack of vision. Now, I've just proposed 5 non-Catholic scholars that I recommend all seminarians at one point or another to pick up and read. C.S. Lewis, Robert Alter, Crispin Fletcher-Louis, let's not forget Craig Keener, and last but not least, Leon Cass. I urge you to read these theologians and thinkers as you make your way into your program, and may God bless you very richly in your study of sacred scripture. I'm Dr. Stephen Smith of Mount St. Mary's Seminary. Please check out my website, thegodwhospeaks.com, www.thegodwhospeaks.com, where you can find a copy of my book, The Word of the Lord, 7 Essential Principles of Catholic Scripture Study. And I also have a number of biblical teaching CDs, including my very popular single-hour CD, The Resurrection of Jesus, Fact or Fiction, which has sold over 10,000 copies, and a number of larger sets, including a set on the biblical mysteries of the Rosary, a larger set on the Resurrection, a very large set on St. John's writings, including the Gospel and Revelation, and much more. God bless.